Clean cut.
I cannot believe that I'm actually making this analysis. Not because I said that the Storm analysis would be my last. We all knew that that was not going to be the case. But it's because this is the Crimson Combo V2. And what's so special about this combo? Well, what's so special about it is that the first setup in this combo is a setup by Romanov. Romanov is one of my favorite DMC players of all time. Like, he's so versatile. He makes insane Dante combos, insane Vergil combos, insane Nero combos. He's probably one of the most versatile DMC players out there. And, you know, I did replicate a few of his setups, like the railway combo, the railroad combo, the water combo. But there was always this one setup that was a thorn in my eye. And I just could not replicate it for the life of me. I could not do it at all. There was nothing I could do. And this was a setup that I saw in, I think the first time I saw it, it was like in April of 2021. That was like 5 years ago. Like 5 years ago. But I didn't start, you know, playing Vergil at an advanced level until April 2022. And it was at that point that I saw this setup and that I was like, wow, I want to replicate this. So let's say that this is a setup that I've been meaning to replicate for 4 years. And every single time I try this setup, once every 8 months, I would just fail miserably. And I chalked it up to, you know, sometimes the game is weird. It's like everyone's DMC is different. Maybe there's simply some setups that cannot be replicated, no matter how hard you try. And I thought this was one of those setups. I even had CAD replicate the setup, and he couldn't do it at first either. This was years ago. So, I finally decided to give it another go. And I realized something incredibly important. So Melancholic Levy, he replicated the setup, and I was like, how the hell did he do it? And then Byanyu and Akuma, I asked for his help, and he replicated the combo in like 3 minutes. And I was like, alright, what the hell is going on? Why am I... What is this? How am I the only one who's unable to do it? And then I realized the mistake I was making. Once I realized that mistake, I was finally able to properly replicate this setup. It's a setup that Romanov has used multiple times, I think 3 to 4 times maybe, 3 times, I don't know, throughout his combo videos, and I've always wanted to replicate it, and now I was finally able to do it, man. You cannot, like, imagine how happy I am about this. So, even though this is something that I was finally able to replicate, I'm not gonna lie, I don't know how I did it. I do know, which is why I'm gonna analyze the combo, I'm gonna analyze the inputs, but there's something way more important when it comes to this setup, and I'm gonna have to explain that in detail later. But anyway, the first part of this combo, the first setup is by Romanov. The second setup is by Ayu. So that's all you need to know, and now let's start the analysis. So you gotta use upper slash tool with the Yamato to launch the enemy into the air. And here's the thing. Here is the thing. You cannot summon the Doppelganger normally. There is no way. So let me explain why that is. What you have to do here is you have to let go of the lock-on. Immediately after using upper slash, you let go of the lock-on, you enemy step, so you jump cancel, you jump, and you keep holding forward. And then you summon the slow version of the Doppelganger. The slow version, alright? The one who is delayed by approximately half a second. This whole setup requires you to use the slow Doppel, not haste. Now, why is this so important? Because this was the reason I was unable to use this setup properly in like 4 years. For 4 years, I couldn't do it. There was no way. And it's because I would keep summoning the doppelganger normally. I would normally, like immediately after upper slash, I would lock on and I would just summon the slow doppel. Now, why is this a problem? It's because this is a guaranteed fail. What happens if you summon the doppelganger normally, you lock on, the doppelganger faces the enemy. And when you use the rest of the setup, the doppelganger will at some point use rapid slash, and you, like Vergil and the doppelganger, will be completely misaligned. The result will be Vergil's, he'll use Yamato combo A, and the thing is, the doppelganger will not be able to catch the enemy with his own Yamato combo A, because Vergil and the doppelganger are misaligned. They can't play tennis if they're misaligned, and the reason they're misaligned is because you summon the doppelganger normally. When the doppelganger is summoned normally, he faces the enemy like this. And you don't want that. This is why you need to, like, immediately after using upper slash, you let go of the lock-on, you jump, and you hold forward, and then you summon the slow doppelganger. If you do that, the doppelganger will not face the enemy. He will face, well, this side, as you can see here. This is crucial. Absolutely crucial. And there are other things at play here. See, it's not enough to simply summon the doppelganger this way by, letting go of the lock-on, holding forward, and using enemy step. No, you also need to make sure that your camera angle when summoning the doppelganger is perfect. You need to make sure that the enemy, Vergil, and the doppelganger are all on the same wavelength, at the same altitude, basically. If they're not, even though you summon the doppelganger in this special way, chances are it will still fail. And I was only able to successfully replicate this setup a total of maybe 5 or 6 times, not even. And I don't even know how I did it. Because of this, I will later explain more about this, because I myself don't know how to properly position the camera when summoning the doppelganger. This is not the first setup that's like that. The Anguish combo that I scrapped was like that. The Rose combo was like that. You basically have to summon the doppelganger in this way. There are a lot of setups where you have to summon the doppelganger by using enemy step, letting go of the lock-on, holding forward, and what matters is you need your camera to be perfect, the camera angle. For the Rose combo, that was not the case. The camera didn't have to be that perfect. But for this combo, it has to be perfect, and I don't know how to help you with that, unfortunately. We'll focus on that later, though. For now, let's just continue analyzing the inputs. So, like I said, upper slash 2, you let go of the lock-on, you jump, you hold forward, you summon the slow version of the doppelganger. You might also want to hold left while summoning the doppelganger. This will bring you closer to the enemy. This is optional, but this is how I did it, and I'll explain why later. For now, you don't need to do that. But just know that while doing this, you might want to hold left so that Vergil can close in on the enemy while summoning the doppelganger. But like I said, entirely optional. After the doppelganger has been summoned, you wait a little for the enemy to lose some altitude. And now you use 1 slash of aerial rave with the Yamato. At this point, you let go of the lock-on, and you use trick up, and you switch the mirage edge. And now you lock on again, and you use air stinger, which is the left plus the tag button, alright? And now, immediately after using air stinger, you press right, and you mash the attack button like 3 to 4 times, basically. Alright, let me explain what happens here. So, is this first slash of aerial rave really necessary? Like, why would you do that? It's very simple. Yes, it is necessary. This is the slow version of the Doppelganger. He reacts to your commands about half a second later. If you don't use this 1/ of aerial rave, what happens is when you use trick up and use air stinger, the enemy falls to the ground because the Doppelganger doesn't react to anything, right? But if you use this 1/ of aerial rave, the Doppelganger will use 1/ of aerial rave himself to keep the enemy airborne. This is why it's imperative to use this 1/ of aerial rave before using trick up. Alright, so that's basically what causes the Doppelganger to use the first slash of aerial rave. Now, when you use air stinger, which is the left plus attack button, what happens is the Doppelganger will use the second hit of aerial rave. And then when you press right and you mash the attack button, the Doppelganger will use aerial cleave, right? But he will use it half a second later because he's delayed. Now, why is that? When you are on the right side, in midair, with the Yamato, pressing right plus attack button is aerial cleave. So, naturally, when you press right and you keep mashing the attack button during air stinger, Vergil doesn't do anything, but the Doppelganger does. He reacts, and he does aerial cleave. At this point, like I said, so again, let's go over this again. You summon the Doppelganger, you use 1/ of aerial rave. You let go of the lock-on. Now, you use trick up and you switch to the mirage edge. Now you lock on again and you press the left plus attack button to use air stinger. And now immediately after pressing left plus attack button, you hold right and you mash the attack button. The Doppelganger does the first 2 hits of aerial rave and then he uses aerial cleave. Also, I don't know if I already said this, but I'm going to say it again just in case. Basically, the moment you press left plus attack button to use air stinger, you immediately press right and you mash the attack button. Don't make any pauses, don't wait. Immediately after you input left plus attack button to use air stinger, you hold right and you mash the attack button. You gotta be real fast. At this point, after you're done with air stinger, you switch to Beowulf and you use starfall, which is just pressing the attack button once. But you're doing all this while holding right and mashing the attack button. So Vergil uses starfall, and the Doppelganger does aerial cleave. At this point, once you've hit the ground with starfall, you immediately, and I mean immediately, switch to the Yamato, and you immediately use Rising Star, which is left plus holding the attack button. Vergil will now launch the enemy into the air, and the Doppelganger will use Rapid Slash about half a second later. Now, why is that? So, the Doppelganger reacts to your commands. He copies your inputs. But since this is the delayed, slow version of the Doppelganger, he copies your commands half a second later. So, when Vergil presses left and he holds the attack button, that is Rising Star. However, the Doppelganger copies your commands half a second later, and he tries to use Rising Star, but he can't. Why is that? It's because Rising Star only activates upon contact with the enemy. So, if you're close to the enemy and you press left and you hold the attack button, that is Rising Star. However, if the enemy is too far away or they're too high up in the air, even though you're pressing left and holding the attack button, Vergil will use Rapid Slash instead of Rising Star. So what happens here basically is the Doppelganger tries to mimic my commands and use Rising Star, but he can't make contact with the enemy because I already launched the enemy into the air with Rising Star. So the only option, the only choice the Doppelganger has is to use Rapid Slash. Alright? You get it? So left plus holding the attack button, Vergil uses Rising Star, the Doppelganger uses Rapid Slash because he can't make contact with the enemy because the enemy is airborne now. At this point, like while you're holding the attack button, like you press the left and you hold the attack button, you hold it for a very long time, and now you use Trig Down, and before you hit the ground fully with Trig Down, you release the attack button. This will cause Vergil to use a Trig Down Judgment Cut. alright? But your timing for this has to be immaculate. Alright? So you gotta make sure you don't hit the ground with Trick Down. You gotta use Trick Down and release the attack button before hitting the ground. Alright? So now that you're done with this Judgment Cut, you use Trick Down again. Alright? And now, you mash the attack button like a maniac. The Doppelganger will use his own Judgment Cut, because he responds to your commands, but he does it half a second later. And now you mash the attack button like a maniac. This will cause Vergil and the Doppelganger to use Yamato Combo A. The first thing that happens is Vergil blows the enemy away towards the Doppelganger with the last hit of Yamato Combo A, and then the Doppelganger blows the enemy away towards Vergil with the last hit of Yamato Combo A, right? It's a tennis match. However, the moment the Doppelganger blows the enemy away towards Vergil using the last hit of Yamato Combo A, you change his mode from slow to normal. I wouldn't recommend haste, but I'm pretty sure that works as well. It doesn't matter. But from slow to normal, alright? One thing that is of paramount importance is you need to change the Doppelganger's mode from slow to normal, but you gotta do it as he's doing the last hit of Yamato Combo A, or before that. If you do it after that, it's over. Or rather, if you do it after you input Stinger, it's over. We'll talk more about that later, but make sure that you change the Doppelganger's mode from slow to normal before using Stinger. And now that he has blown the enemy away towards Vergil, you use Trick Down to gain some distance, you switch to the Mirage Edge, and you use Stinger, which is left plus attack button. Vergil uses Stinger to blow the enemy away towards the Doppelganger, and the Doppelganger reacts by using upper/1. Why is that? Basically, when you're on the ground, on the right side with the Mirage Edge, left plus attack button is Stinger. But the Doppelganger can only use the Yamato, and he is on the left side on the ground with the Yamato. When you press the left plus attack button on the ground with the Yamato on the left side, that is upper/1. So because the Doppelganger can only use the Yamato, and because he copies your commands, when you press the left plus attack button, he will use upper/1 to launch the enemy into the air, basically. But, of course, like I said, after using Stinger, you immediately use Trick Down again, okay? And now, when the Doppelganger has launched the enemy into the air, using upper/, you switch to the Yamato, and you deactivate the Doppelganger, and you use Air Trick to teleport to the enemy. Now you use Aerial Rave B, completely optional, I think, and you summon the haste version of the Doppelganger, the one who is in sync with you and mimics all your commands immediately, alright? The moment the Doppelganger has been summoned, you use Trick Down, you wait a little, and you use Rapid Slash, which is left plus attack button. This will cause the Doppelganger to use the first hit of Aerial Rave to keep the enemy airborne. Because, you know, he reacts to your commands. When you press the left plus attack button, Vergil does Rapid Slash, but the Doppelganger reacts to that, and he uses the first hit of Aerial Rave. And this keeps the enemy airborne. It keeps the enemy from falling. Immediately after using Rapid Slash, right, to go left, you call the Doppelganger back to your position, in my case by pressing V, and now you wait a little, basically, for the enemy to almost hit the ground. Once the enemy has almost hit the ground, you input Rising Star, which is right plus holding the attack button. This will cause the Doppelganger to use Rising Star, because right plus holding the attack button on the left side on the ground with the Yamato is Rising Star. Vergil will not do anything, because Vergil is too busy sheathing his sword after using Rapid Slash. As you already know, when Vergil is sheathing his sword, especially after Rapid Slash, he does not react to melee commands. But the Doppelganger does. And this is why, when you press right and you hold the attack button, the Doppelganger does Rising Star, and he launches the enemy into the air. At this point, you switch to the Mirage Edge, and now you want the Doppelganger to use Aerial Rave B, and you want Vergil to catch the enemy with Mirage Edge Combo B. But let me analyze this whole segment now. Alright, so before I analyze this laughably easy setup, I gotta talk about Aerial Rave B. As you guys already know, Aerial Rave B is attack button, pause, then you press the attack button one more time so that the Doppelganger can use this roulette spin, and then you press the attack button one more time to use the final hit of Aerial Rave B. However, for the purposes of this combo, let's pretend that using Aerial Rave B is pressing the attack button 3 times, not 2 times, because you can use the first 2 hits of Aerial Rave B by pressing the attack button twice or thrice. It doesn't matter. So you can press the attack button 2 times or 3 times. It doesn't matter. Vergil will still use the first 2 hits of Aerial Rave B. Alright? So for the purposes of this combo, let's say that you gotta use Aerial Rave B by pressing the attack button 3 times, then making a pause after this, second hit of Aerial Rave B. Then you press the attack button one more time so that the Doppelganger can use this roulette spin, and then you press the attack button one more time after that so that the Doppelganger can use the last hit of Aerial Rave B. Alright? Now, let me explain how Mirage Edge Combo B works. So, Mirage Edge Combo B it consists of, 3 hits. This is the first hit. Even though Vergil uses 2 slashes, he swings his sword 2 times, this is only 1 press of the attack button. And this whole thing here, where he swings his sword 3 to 4 times, that is also only 1 hit. It is only 1 press of the attack button. Okay? So, how do you want Mirage Edge Combo B to look in this combo? So, this is how it works. Mirage Edge Combo B is, you press the attack button 3 times, and you make a pause, alright? And Vergil does these 2 slashes. Then, you press the attack button one more time, and Vergil does this other, this swing, basically. And now you make a lengthy pause. After this lengthy pause, you just mash the attack button like a maniac, basically. That's how this works. Alright? So let's see how this works in practice. So, you press the attack button 3 times. Vergil uses the first hit, these 2 slashes of Mirage Edge Combo B, and the Doppelganger uses the first 2 hits of Aerial Rave B. And now you make a pause because this pause is required for Aerial Rave B. So now, after you've made this small pause, you press the attack button one more time. This causes the Doppelganger to use the roulette spin of Aerial Rave B, and it causes Vergil to use the second hit of Mirage Edge Combo B, this swing, right? This is only the second hit. So he uses this, and now you make a pause, of course. And now, you press the attack button one more time, and the Doppelganger uses the final hit of Aerial Rave B, and he pins the enemy to the ground, and Vergil does this X-slash of Mirage Edge Combo B. And now, you just deactivate the Doppelganger, and you continue mashing like a maniac. So, again, if you don't make this pause, if you press the attack button 4 times, for example, what's going to happen is the Doppelganger will use Aerial Rave A instead of B. Because Aerial Rave A is mashing the attack button 4 times without making any pause. But Aerial Rave B is, you press the attack button 3 times, and then you make a pause. Right? A very short pause. This is why this pause is required, basically. If you don't make the second pause, Vergil will use Mirage Edge Combo A. That is why the second pause is required. Basically, the first pause you make after pressing the attack button 3 times is so that the Doppelganger can use Aerial Rave B. It needs that pause after the second hit of Aerial Rave B. The second pause you make, however, is so that Vergil can use Mirage Edge Combo B. This second pause needs to be lengthier, because Mirage Edge Combo B requires a somewhat lengthy pause. If the pause you make isn't long enough, or you don't make any pause, Vergil does Mirage Edge Combo A, and you don't want that. So you might think that's it. All I gotta do now is mash like a maniac, and that's the end of the combo. But no. Of course, things are never that easy. So, if you just deactivate the Doppelganger, and you just lock on, and you mash like a maniac, this is what happens 99.9% of the time. The final hit of Mirage Edge Combo B disconnects, because the enemy's altitude is all screwed up. So, This happens, like I said, almost every time. And there is apparently no way to fix it. Except there is. There is a way to fix it. And I'm going to tell you that way right now. So, what you gotta do is, after the Doppelganger has pinned the enemy to the ground using the final hit of Aerial Rave B, you mash like a maniac. But now you let go of the lock-on, and you keep holding right. You let go of the lock-on, and you keep holding right, and you go through the enemy while you're mashing, right? And at some point, the enemy will lose a little bit of altitude. Now, you lock on again, and you keep mashing. And Vergil will use Mirage Edge Combo B as intended. He will do it properly. The reason Mirage Edge Combo B, the reason the final hit, this crescent pirouette thing, the circle, the reason it disconnects is because the enemy's altitude is too high, and Vergil doesn't even know where he's hitting. He goes spastic. You want the enemy to lose a little bit of altitude, to get closer to the ground, and the way to do that is, while mashing, you let go of the lock-on, and you hold right. Now Vergil will go through the enemy, and now, at some point, you lock on again when the enemy has lost enough altitude, and you just continue mashing while being locked on. That is how you fix this. However, there are a lot of mistakes you can make. Sometimes, you might lock on too late, and the enemy will lose so much altitude that they will actually fall to the ground before you're able to catch them with Mirage Edge Combo B. However, sometimes you can lock on again, but way too early. And as a result, what happens is, you locked on too early, the enemy didn't lose enough altitude, they weren't close enough to the ground, so when you lock on again, Vergil will keep mashing, he'll use Mirage Edge Combo B, but now the enemy will fall to the ground, and it'll just be a mess, basically. So you gotta have perfect timing. I cannot stress how important having perfect timing is here. So you let go of the lock-on, you hold right, and you keep mashing. Once you see that the enemy has lost enough altitude that they're close to the ground, you lock on again, and you keep mashing, basically. You never stop mashing. However, if you wait too long and the enemy loses too much altitude, they will fall to the ground before you can lock on again and catch them. But sometimes you might miscalculate and you might lock on too early, and the enemy still hasn't lost enough altitude, and as a result, you're cooked, basically. So that is the end of the Crimson Combo V-Tool. Now let's talk about all the issues you can encounter and all the mistakes you can make during this combo. So the first thing can happen is the Doppelganger will sometimes ghost the first hit of Aerial Rave. You know that one slash you make immediately after summoning him? Yes, sometimes he will ghost you. I don't know if this happens because you use the slash way too early after summoning him, but it's definitely something that has happened on multiple occasions. This happened a lot, so. Now we got Air Stinger's hitbox. Remember how I told you how immediately after summoning the Doppelganger, you wait for the enemy to lose a bit of altitude. You wait a full second if need be, and then you use the first slash of Aerial Rave. If you're not slow enough, if you're too hasty, what happens is, when you use Trick Up and you attempt to use Air Stinger, Vergil will hit this invisible wall. And, well, everything fails. The way I see it, this is an issue with the enemy's altitude. You really gotta wait for the enemy to lose a lot of altitude before you start that one slash of Aerial Rave and before you use Trick Up and Air Stinger. So don't use it too early. Now here you can see how I use Lunar Phase instead of Starfall. And it really begs the question, why doesn't this happen more frequently? When you're on the left side in midair with Beowulf, pressing right plus the tag button is Lunar Phase. Yet most of the time, when I keep holding right and I press the attack button, Vergil uses Starfall. I guess this has to do with the fact that I kind of did it too late or something. Like, if you look at this, I press left plus attack button to use Air Stinger, and I'm supposed to immediately press right and mash the attack button after this. However, I wait a long time, and then I press right plus attack button after Vergil is done with Air Stinger, so I'm giving him time to react, basically. This happened a few times, but like I said, it's really, really not frequent. It's just something that can happen, and I sometimes wonder why it's not more frequent. Sometimes the Doppelganger will use aerial rave A instead of B, and this was incredibly frequent, and I simply did not know what was causing this. But now in the video editor that I've analyzed all this, I finally understand why this kept happening. And it's very easy to miss. We're talking about nanoseconds, frames. So let me explain once again how this works. So as you already know, in this setup, the Doppel uses 2 slashes of aerial rave, and then he uses aerial cleave, right? So when you summon the Doppelganger, you use 1 slash of aerial rave. He will react to that half a second later. Then, when you use Trick Up, you use Air Stinger, and the Doppel will react to that half a second later. And then you immediately press right and you mash the attack button, and the Doppel will use aerial cleave. That's how this works. However, in all of these examples, what you'll notice is that I use the first slash of aerial rave, and then I use Air Stinger, which is left plus attack button, and immediately after using Air Stinger, instead of pressing right plus attack button, I press attack button, and then right plus attack button, and I mash the attack button. This caused the Doppelganger to use 1 additional hit of aerial rave, and he didn't notice any pause or anything, and he just used aerial rave A instead of B. Do you understand what I mean? The mistake I made here was, instead of pressing left plus attack button, which is Air Stinger, and immediately pressing right plus attack button, I instead pressed left plus attack button plus right plus attack button. I didn't even realize this. The problem was I pressed the attack button before I pressed right. And as a result, the Doppelganger used all of this. So, in all of these examples, the Doppelganger uses aerial rave A instead of B. So, in all of these instances, it's the same exact thing. You know, the Doppelganger basically uses aerial rave A instead of B because I pressed the left plus attack button to use Air Stinger, and then instead of immediately pressing right plus attack button, I pressed attack button plus right plus attack button. And I didn't even realize it, because I thought, I was convinced that I pressed right first and then the attack button, but that was not the case. We're talking about like nanoseconds, like I said. Alright, so this is another incredibly frequent issue. In all of these examples, the Doppelganger uses aerial cleave too late, and as a result, when I'm done with Starfall and when I use Rising Star, he does not use Rapid Slash. In the original combo, when I start Starfall, the Doppelganger starts aerial cleave, and when I use Rising Star, the Doppelganger is already done with aerial cleave, right? That's how it works, and that's why he's able to use Rapid Slash. However, in all of these examples, you'll notice one thing, and that one thing is, when I use Starfall, the Doppelganger doesn't start aerial cleave. He's barely done with the second hit of aerial rave. So when I start Rising Star, the Doppelganger starts aerial cleave. He's supposed to be finishing aerial cleave by the time I start using Rising Star, but he doesn't. He only starts aerial cleave when I start Rising Star. So in the original analysis, I use Air Stinger, which is left plus attack button, and I immediately press right and I mash the attack button. So I input aerial cleave immediately after inputting Air Stinger. Left plus attack button, and then immediately right plus attack button, and I mash the attack button. What I did in all of these examples that you're seeing right now is I used Air Stinger, which is left plus attack button, and I waited way too long before pressing right plus attack button. So I waited way too long before inputting aerial cleave after Air Stinger. You're not supposed to make this pause. You're supposed to input aerial cleave immediately after air stinger, left plus attack button, and then immediately right plus attack button, and you mash it. If you wait too long, this happens. This is another problem that is incredibly frequent, and I'm not sure I know how to explain it. So in all of these examples, the Doppelganger only uses one hit of aerial rave before aerial cleave. He's supposed to use 2 slashes of aerial rave and then use aerial cleave. So let's analyze this. I summon the Doppelganger and I use that 1 slash of aerial rave. He reacts to that. Then I use Trick Up and I use Air Stinger, but he doesn't react to that, and he doesn't do that 2nd slash of Aerial Rave. And when I input Aerial Cleave, which is right plus attack button, he reacts to that. So he basically ghosts my 2nd input. When I use Air Stinger, which is left plus attack button, the Doppelganger doesn't react to this, and he doesn't use the 2nd slash of Aerial Rave. I really have no idea why this happens. Maybe I do it too early or too late. I really don't think that's the issue here. I think this is one of those good old, Doppelganger ghosting you issues. And I really don't know how else I could possibly explain this and make it make sense. But these aren't the only few issues you can encounter with aerial cleave. Sometimes, and this is incredibly frequent, the Doppelganger uses aerial cleave in time and everything's fine and dandy. However, there's one small, teeny tiny issue. The Doppelganger's aerial cleave provides no knockback. So as you guys already know, aerial cleave pins the enemy to the ground, and then the enemy bounces up into the air after hitting the ground. But if you're too high up, if the enemy is too high up compared to Vergil, or in this case, the Doppelganger, or if you're too far away from the enemy, if there's a gap between Vergil and the enemy, when you use aerial cleave, there will be no bounce-up effect. There will be no knockback. This happens a lot with aerial cleave. You gotta be really close to the enemy. So how exactly do you fix something like this? Because what happens if there is no aerial cleave bounce-up effect? What happens is Vergil uses Rising Star, right? And he launches the enemy into the air. But the Doppelganger also uses Rising Star. Remember that thing I told you in the beginning? Basically, what you're supposed to do is you launch the enemy into the air with Rising Star, and now the Doppelganger copies your inputs, but he can't use Rising Star because you launch the enemy into the air with Rising Star, and he can't make contact with the enemy. And the reason this happens is because of the aerial cleave bounce-up effect, right? However, if there's no bounce-up effect, the Doppelganger can make contact with the enemy because he's on the ground, right? Look at it that way. And this is why, when there is no aerial cleave bounce-up effect, if there's no knockback, both Vergil and the Doppelganger use Rising Star. The Doppelganger doesn't use Rapid Slash because he's able to make contact with the enemy. But the core issue here is, why did this happen? This happened because Vergil and the Doppelganger were way too far away from the enemy. So when the Doppelganger used aerial cleave, he wasn't close enough, and there was no knockback, no bounce-up effect. So how do you fix this? You fix this by holding left. This is the thing I told you before. Basically, while summoning the Doppelganger, you let go of the lock-on, you jump, and you hold forward, and you summon the slow version of the Doppelganger. But while doing this, you keep holding left, so that while summoning the Doppelganger, Vergil can move to the left, so that he can be closer to the enemy. This is what I did in the original combo as well. As you can see, notice how I'm while summoning the Doppelganger, Vergil is moving to the left. He's moving closer to the enemy. This is one way to fix this. But most of the time, most people, they don't need this. But sometimes I need this, and it happened a lot. So I don't know if this is if what I'm telling you is valid. All I know is it worked for me. But according to CAD, this has nothing to do with the distance between Vergil and the enemy, and it has everything to do with the enemy's altitude. Basically, the reason this happens, according to CAD, is because I am using the first slash of aerial rave too fast, and I use trick up too fast. So basically, you're supposed to wait a long time for the enemy to lose a little bit of altitude, and then use trick up, do all these things. Like, you use that one slash of aerial rave, then you use trick up, then air stinger. Otherwise, the enemy will be at a higher altitude than the Doppelganger, and because of that, the Doppelganger will use aerial cleave like this, and there will be no bounce up effect. Because, like I said, if the enemy is too high up, if they're higher than you, and you try to use aerial cleave, there will be no bounce up effect. So you gotta wait for the enemy to lose altitude before doing any of this. Well, this is really common. So sometimes I will use Rising Star way too late. And as a result, instead of using Rising Star, Vergil uses Rapid Slash. Now, why is that? Like I said, when the Doppelganger uses aerial cleave, there is this bounce up effect, and the enemy bounces up into the air. It is imperative that immediately after Starfall, that very nanosecond, you switch to the Yamato and you use Rising Star before the enemy can bounce up into the air. What happened here was I used Rising Star way too late. Aerial Cleave caused the enemy to bounce up into the air, and when I try to use Rising Star, I can't make contact with the enemy. The enemy is too high up in the air, and as a result, I end up using Rapid Slash. In all of these instances, this happened a billion times, and it's all because Rising Star cannot activate unless you're making contact with the enemy. And how am I supposed to make contact with the enemy when the enemy is airborne? Aerial Cleave caused them to bounce up into the air. This is why it's so important to use Rising Star immediately after hitting the ground with Starfall. Before you can even notice that the enemy is going to bounce up into the air, you use Rising Star. Before you can even see any bounce up effect, the enemy needs to be like 1 millimeter away from the ground. If you're too late, it's GG. But like I said, sometimes that one issue can happen with, the Doppelganger and Vergil using Rising Star in tandem, but that only happens if, you're too far away from the enemy and aerial cleave provides no bounce-up effect. Ah, yes. This one is incredibly common. In fact, I would venture to say this might just be top 3, maybe even top 1, top 3 most frequent issues I've encountered. So, like I said, when you use Rising Star, you gotta hold the attack button for a very long time. And then you use Trig Down, right? And you let go of the attack button before you hit the ground, right? And this will cause Vergil to use this Trig Down Judgment Cut. However, if you use Trig Down and you let go of the attack button way too late, after hitting the ground, it's over. Vergil will hit the ground, and then he will use a regular Judgment Cut, and this whole thing fails. So this happened because I used Trig Down, and I let go of the attack button way too late. Vergil already hit the ground with Trig Down, and only then did I let go of the attack button. You're supposed to let go of the attack button, really, really early, and make sure that everything works out as planned. Otherwise, this will happen, and this is definitely one of the most frequent mistakes that I would make. Conversely, sometimes you can let go of the attack button way too early, and this is a problem. See, if you let go of the attack button way too late, Vergil will hit the ground, and then he will use a normal Judgment Cut. But if you use Trig Down and immediately let go of the attack button, Vergil will use a Judgment Cut, a Trig Down Judgment Cut, but he will barely alter his position. He won't be far enough from the enemy. And as a result, when you use Trig Down after this Judgment Cut, Vergil will be too close to the enemy, and then this happens. Peep all of these examples. These are all completely different examples, completely different instances. I use this Trig Judgment Cut, but I am literally in the same position when I use it. There's basically no change in my altitude, no change in my distance, right? Like, it's all completely the same. And this happened because I let go of the attack button immediately after using Trig Down. You're supposed to wait. Like, I've lost count, like, as to how many times this has happened. I don't even know. But what happens after this, as you can see, is you are too close to the enemy after the second Trig Down, and, well, you already see what happens. The combo fails miserably. Notice how in the original analysis, like in the original combo, the successful attempt, when I use Trig Down after Rising Star, I gain some momentum, I gain some distance away from the enemy, and I lose some altitude. I am closer to the ground. So when I use the second Trig Down, I'm farther away from the enemy. Get that? This is why this happens. So it's like, pick your poison. If you do it too late, you fall to the ground, normal judgment cut. If you do it too early, this happens. But worry not, because there is a way to fix this. Kind of, but it's not foolproof. So if you notice that Vergil has, like, stayed in the same position like this after using this judgment cut, you gotta use Trig Down twice. So once and twice. Once to, teleport to the ground, and another time so that you can gain some distance. As a result, Vergil will be far away from the enemy, and it'll all work out. However, in this example that I'm showing you right now, I used this double Trig Down after the judgment cut, and it barely connected, but it did. However, when I used Stinger, and the Doppelganger used, upper slash did not connect, because the enemy was too far away from the Doppelganger. And I don't know if this happened because of the double Trig Down, but there was another instance where upper slash didn't even come out. So here it didn't connect. In this instance, it literally didn't even, appear. Like, as you can see, I used the double Trig Down, I used everything properly. Left plus attack button, nope. Nothing. I don't know if this is because I may have changed the Doppelganger's mode way too late or something, but this happened multiple times. These are two completely different instances, by the way. So even though it maybe could have worked, I don't know. Like, all I know is there's no upper slash in these two instances. And here you can see how this double Trig Down, barely reaches. Like, I barely grazed the enemy with the final hit of Yamato Combo A. And still, no upper slash at all. So, yeah, maybe it's because, I think it's because I changed the Doppelganger's mode to normal at the wrong time. I think that's why this happens. But we'll talk about this later, basically. So, this is one way to circumvent that issue. If you notice that Vergil is not far enough away from the enemy, that they're not close enough to the ground after using that Trig Down judgment cut, you gotta use Trig Down twice. Once to descend to the ground, and the other time to gain more distance. That is one way to fix this. If you don't use a double Trig Down, and you notice that this is Vergil's position, it's over. That one mistake will happen, that one issue, right? So you gotta make sure that everything's perfect. However, if you notice that Vergil's altitude is perfect after using a Trig Down judgment cut, just use Trig Down one more time, and it'll be enough. I think it's really simple. You'll be able to gauge this immediately if you have a brain and eyes. However, sometimes this double Trig Down simply doesn't work, because as you can see here, Yamato Combo A doesn't reach. So if I had used Trig Down only once, it wouldn't have worked. I would have been too close and it would have failed. But here, I was too far away, and, well, even though I used Trig Down twice, it didn't work because, well, I couldn't connect Yamato Combo A. This happens incredibly frequently. So my advice to you regarding this whole Trig Down judgment cut thing is to know exactly when to do it. You need perfect timing. I know this is kind of like something that I don't talk about normally, but there's this whole tutorial I plan to make on trick judgment cuts. It's really, it's pure timing. It's pure muscle memory, and it tends to be very inconsistent. So Definitely this is a timing thing. TLDR, if you use this trick down Judgment Cut and you release the attack button way too late, Vergil might actually use Trig Down and he might teleport to the ground and then use a normal Judgment Cut. That happens if you release the attack button way too late. However, if you release the attack button way too early, Vergil's position will barely change, and he will barely lose any altitude, and he won't gain any distance. So he will be close to the enemy. When you notice that after this Trig Down Judgment Cut, Vergil's position is almost the same, that is a clear indicator that you need a double Trig Down. So you need one Trig Down to teleport to the ground, and one more to gain even more distance away from the enemy. However, if you notice that after using this Trig Down Judgment Cut, Vergil is close to the ground, or that he's gained a lot of distance away from the enemy, or that he's at a lower altitude, at that point, in that case, you only need one Trig Down. Alright, you gotta be able to calculate it. You can see these examples here, where sometimes when I use the Trig Down Judgment Cut, I'm very close to the ground, and I only need one Trig Down. But sometimes I'm very close to the enemy, and I need a double Trig Down. And of course, if you notice that Vergil is close to the enemy, that his altitude hasn't changed that much, that his distance is more or less the same, and you decide not to use a double Trig Down, like you only use one Trig Down in Yamato Combo A, what happens is this: Vergil is too close to the enemy, Yamato Combo A misses, and you get this whole issue. However, sometimes, even though you've used a double Trig Down, Yamato Combo A might not reach the enemy because you're way too far away from them. So it's like, pick your poison. You know, even though you're probably going to be able to see this and gauge the distance with your own eyes, it's not foolproof, right? So this ultimately is all about timing. Here you can see how I stopped mashing way too early, and as a result, the Doppelganger didn't use the end of Yamato Combo A. This happened more times than I'm willing to admit, and it's incredibly annoying. Here you can see how the Doppelganger ended up using Yamato Combo B instead of A. I guess I made some pause that I can't even see here for some reason. Maybe it's because of when I changed the Doppelganger's mode. All I know is this is kind of crazy because it would have worked, I think. And here, I titled this WTF, and I even uploaded this attempt, and I titled it, I will never be able to replicate this again. But it did happen like 3 times, I think. Instead of using Yamato Combo A, the Doppelganger uses Yamato Combo C. And it works! Look at this! This is one whole successful attempt where instead of using Yamato Combo A, the Doppelganger uses Yamato Combo C. I guess it has to do with when I mashed, how long I was mashing, how fast I was mashing, and maybe I threw in a pause somewhere in there. I don't really know. All I know is this can happen, but it's really rare. Here you can see how the combo was gonna work, or well, the setup was gonna work, but instead of using Trig Down, I use Air Trick. I mean, yeah, let's just not, bro, like, no. Here you can see how it almost worked, but I guess in some weird way, the Doppelganger and Vergil were way too close when they used Yamato Combo A. This is like an overlap. I don't know how this happened or why. Maybe it's an alignment issue. I don't really know, but it's something that can definitely happen. Here you can see how it almost worked, but I didn't use Trig Down in time to cancel Stinger. So I blew the enemy into the Doppelganger, basically. I think that's what happened here. You're supposed to cancel Stinger with Trig Down immediately after using it. And here, I simply didn't do that. And as a result, this happened. Like, a few times. These are different attempts. Now here you can see how Stinger doesn't even reach, and the enemy falls to the ground before I can use it, and I don't know if this is an alignment issue. I will talk about this right now, but I think this may have been a misalignment issue. Speaking of, here I simply forgot to use Stinger. I mean, bro, can you blame me? I was overwhelmed, man. You gotta press a lot of things, and this is something that can happen, but only if you're like me, which, only if you're stupid, basically. So, yeah. Now, speaking of misalignment, I told you how if you summon the Doppelganger normally, and he's facing the enemy, 100% of the time, the Doppelganger and Vergil will be completely misaligned, meaning that the Doppelganger will not be able to hit the enemy with the final hit of Yamato combo A. You can see here how the Doppelganger doesn't go in a straight line compared to Vergil. He wanders off somewhere, and that is because of his position when you started the setup. This is why you gotta summon the Doppelganger in that special way. You let go of the lock-on, you hold forward, you jump, you summon the Doppelganger, you get the point. However, remember how I told you how this is not enough? You need to make sure that your camera angle is perfect when you do this. And unfortunately, this is something that I simply cannot help you with. I don't know how. But I can show you the consequences. So, in all of these examples that you're seeing right now, I summoned the Doppelganger in that special way. I didn't summon him normally. I did use enemy step. I did let go of the lock-on. I was holding forward. And even though everything was perfect input-wise, the combo fails. Because Yamato combo A, the tennis match, just look at all of these examples. I think there are over 10 examples here, and these are just some of the examples that I recorded. So here, input-wise, everything was perfect, but everything else failed. Even though I summoned the Doppelganger in that other way. So, this is the most frequent issue you can experience with this combo, with this setup and with this combo. It is absolutely bonkers, man. This is the reason why I keep saying that I simply cannot recommend this setup, because the truth of the matter is I don't know how to do it. I only did it by pure chance. It was luck. It was nothing else. If I go into the void right now and I try the setup, I will fail. Not because of the inputs, not because of anything else, but because I am unable to see what everyone else sees. Byanyu on Akuma was able to replicate this in like 3 minutes. No less. Levy did it in 5 minutes. CAD, they're all able to see what I am unable to see. This is the same issue I had with the scrapped Anguish combo. I don't understand what these people are seeing. Because you gotta have an eye for it. You gotta make sure that you tilt your camera to the left or to the right. I don't really know. I'm actually gonna ask them so we can have a chat about that. Speaking of misalignment, I think this was also an alignment issue. Everything seemed to be working well, the tennis match kind of worked, but when I used Stinger, the Doppelganger didn't use upper slash, and I think it's because of the camera angle. Look at how I barely did the tennis match. Like, Vergil blows the enemy away, and then look at how the Doppelganger hits the enemy. He doesn't blow them away towards Vergil like that. You get the point? Like, they're not on the same wavelength. They're not in a straight line. You know what I mean? Can't you see that? I hope you can see what I mean. But this is also an alignment issue. I'm 1,000,000,000% sure. Now, here you can see how the Doppelganger didn't use upper slash. But this time, I don't think it was an alignment issue. I think they were perfectly aligned. I believe that the reason this issue keeps persisting is because I am doing something fundamentally wrong. Look at this. I use Stinger, right? After the Doppelganger has used the final hit of Yamato combo A. I use Stinger, and I basically change the Doppelganger's mode from slow to normal. I believe that this makes it so that the Doppelganger cannot react to what I'm actually pressing. And as a result, he doesn't use upper slash. Let's look at the normal analysis, the one that was perfect. So I use the last hit of Yamato Combo A to blow the enemy away towards the Doppelganger, and now the Doppelganger uses the last hit of Yamato Combo A, and at this point, I change his mode from slow to normal, and then I use Stinger, and he reacts. Now let's look at all of these attempts where the Doppelganger fails to use upper slash, and he doesn't react. Let's see why that happens. Let's see if there's a pattern. So here, the Doppelganger is done with the final hit of Yamato Combo A, and I don't change his mode. Then I use Stinger, right? And then I change the Doppelganger's mode. And he doesn't react because I changed his mode. And I guess that cancels out everything. Here you can see the same thing happen as well. I don't change the Doppelganger's mode when he does the final hit of Yamato Combo A. I do it after I use Stinger. And because of that, he doesn't react, and he doesn't do upper slash. Another example where the same exact thing happens. I use the last hit of Yamato Combo A, so does the Doppelganger. Now I use Stinger, and I change the Doppelganger's mode after I start Stinger. And obviously that is why this didn't work. Same exact thing happens here. I use Stinger and then I change the Doppelganger's mode. In all of these examples, there is a clear pattern. I change the Doppelganger's mode after I started Stinger. So make sure you change the Doppelganger's mode from slow to normal either during the final hit of Yamato Combo A or before he starts the final hit of Yamato Combo A. This is imperative. If you change his mode after you've already started Stinger, he will not react to any of your commands, and he won't do anything. He won't use upper slash. So during the final setup, one of the issues you can encounter is Vergil using void slash instead of rapid slash. Now, when you're on the right side on the ground with the Yamato, rapid slash is left plus the tag button, but void slash is right plus left plus the tag button. So D plus A plus left mouse button. However, before you use rapid slash, you gotta use trig down, which in my case is D plus A plus E. But let's just say it's DE, because I use SOCon's trainer that makes it so that I can use trig down on back plus trig button instead of back plus forward plus trig button. So I press D plus E, like right plus trig button to use trig down, and then I press left plus the tag button, which is A plus left mouse button to use rapid slash. However, Vergil uses void slash instead. Why is that? It's because I pressed right and then left and then a tag button. It's like I pressed right plus trig to use trig down, but that right was still, it was remembered by the game, so when I pressed left, I ended up using void slash. The game registered me pressing right plus left plus the tag button, D plus A plus left mouse button. The way to fix this is wait a little. After using trig down, wait a little, a fraction of a second, before using rapid slash. Like, you use trig down, you wait, and then you press left plus the tag button. If you do it too fast, if you try to use rapid slash way too fast, Vergil will inevitably, well, not inevitably, but very frequently use void slash instead. Sometimes the Doppelganger will use rapid slash instead of rising star. I've already explained this. Basically, you gotta call the Doppelganger back to your position and wait for the enemy to almost hit the ground before inputting rising star. If you do it too early, you press right and you hold the attack button, the Doppelganger will use rapid slash because he can't make contact with the enemy. The enemy is too high up in the air. We've been over this, no need to talk about it again. Sometimes the Doppel will use aerial rave A instead of B, and that happens if you press the attack button 4 times or more instead of 3 times. So he will use aerial rave A, because aerial rave A is mashing like a maniac. You gotta press the attack button 3 times and then make a pause. if you want him to use Aerial Rave B. Now here you can see how Vergil uses Mirage Edge combo A instead of combo B. And how the hell did that happen? It's very simple. So I press the attack button 3 times, I make a pause, then I press the attack button 1 more time, and then I make a pause, but it's too short, and I press the attack button 2 more times, and as a result, he uses the final hit of Mirage Edge combo A. So essentially, after I made the first pause, I pressed the attack button 1 more time, which was great, but the pause I made after this hit was way too short. And then I continue mashing, and Vergil uses Mirage Edge combo A. This was a really frequent mistake for some reason. The Doppelganger would reset Aerial Rave B after the roulette spin. So I press the attack button 3 times and make a pause. I press the attack button 1 more time, and then I make a pause that is way too long. And when I resume mashing, the Doppelganger resets Aerial Rave B. Basically, the second pause that I made was way too long. It wasn't too long for Vergil. He did end up using Mirage Edge combo B, but it was too long for the Doppelganger, who used Aerial Rave B and then reset it after the roulette spin. This happened more times than I'm willing to admit, honestly. I don't even know why. I guess the pause, like, it really cannot be too long. Otherwise, this happens. You do not want the Doppel to reset Aerial Rave B. Here, however, you can see how Vergil resets Mirage Edge combo B after the first hit. So I press the attack button 3 times, and I make a pause that is way too long. Now I resume mashing, and he resets Mirage Edge combo B. However, the Doppelganger, he does everything properly. He does the first 2 hits of Aerial Rave B. When I make a pause and resume mashing, he does the roulette spin. So this doesn't affect the Doppel, but it does affect Vergil. The pause I made, like after that 3rd press of the attack button, was way too long, and you can see that in all of these instances. This was also pretty frequent, but when I say frequent, I mean this setup does not, like, you can't make that many mistakes. There aren't that many issues you can encounter. So it's for the, like, one of the most frequent issues, yeah, but it's not, you're not going to make a lot of mistakes here to begin with. Now here you can see how the Doppelganger doesn't use the final hit of Aerial Rave B. I don't know if he ghosted me or if I didn't mash. I think I should have mashed. So I press the attack button 3 times. Vergil does the first hit of Mirage Edge combo B. The Doppelganger does the first 2 hits of Aerial Rave B. I make a pause. Then I press the attack button 1 more time. Vergil does the second hit of Mirage Edge combo B. The Doppelganger does the roulette spin. And then I make a pause and I resume mashing. I press the attack button, but the Doppelganger doesn't do anything. So I don't know if he ghosted me. I don't know if I should have mashed. I really couldn't tell you. But this did happen. And I don't know how many times it happened. I mean, this is the only recorded instance I have, but I do feel like this happened on multiple occasions. Here you can see how I waited way too long before I started mashing, so after the X-slash, I didn't mash immediately, and as a result, the enemy fell to the ground. So, yeah, something that can happen, basically. And we've already been over these. If you don't let go of the lock-on, if you just do this normally, you mash, this happens. The final hit of Mirage Edge combo B will disconnect, and this will happen 99.9% of the time. However, if you lock on again, but you do it way too late, that is also a problem, because if you don't lock on in time, or well, re-lock on, the enemy falls to the ground. They lose way too much altitude. But sometimes you can let go of the lock-on, and the enemy doesn't lose enough altitude, and you lock on way too early, and as a result, this happens. So it fails either way. You gotta have perfect timing. You gotta know exactly when to re-lock on. So you let the enemy lose a little bit of altitude, you make sure they're closer to the ground, but make sure they don't hit the ground. And then you can lock on again and continue mashing, basically. This happened a billion times. This is an issue with Mirage Edge combo B. I didn't mash. I basically didn't mash fast enough. I didn't mash hard enough. And as a result, Vergil just stopped Mirage Edge combo B midway. This is an issue with Mirage Edge Combo B. This combo requires you to mash like a maniac. You need to assault your melee button, basically. Otherwise, it will not work. It will stop midway. I cannot stress how much you gotta mash to use Mirage Edge Combo B. You gotta mash like a maniac, like, like basically like this, like that's what you gotta do. So you gotta mash like a maniac, otherwise it fails. Here you can see this perfect attempt. I was gonna upload this. I was crashing out on Discord with my friends when this happened. I was like, no, because I didn't even know this combo is difficult enough as is for me because of that setup. I don't really know how to even do it. And then I was finally done, and this happens. Wow. I have no words. I literally have no words. But yeah, that's it for the Crimson Combo V-Tool. I don't really have anything more to add. It's an incredibly cool combo, but it's also incredibly inconsistent, and I have no idea how I even did that first setup, honestly. I mean, because of the camera angle, I still don't get it. So, yeah. See ya and peace out.